Laredo, we had our sheriff who participated in an event and basically condoned the usage of blackface and not fully understanding how that was significant and impactful for our African-American Black community that's here, and understanding the Native roots behind that. And I find that that's not unique just to Laredo. We saw in the video clip there, we had a individual who, there was a Governor Northman of Virginia was caught in early 2019 when he was in medical school having been in blackface. Well, then in Virginia has a deep history as it relates to oppressive structures for Black and African American folk. Governor Northman is a Democrat. The lieutenant governor was a Black and is a Black individual. So the person who would have taken charge next, Justin Fairfax, is the lieutenant governor. But he was going through his own scandal related to, I forget exactly what it is. And then the third person who was in charge of the state of Virginia, their attorney general, was Mark Herring, who also posed in blackface in the 1980s, right? So this is something that continues to go on. All three of those were Democrats. And so it's not just a conservative thing. It's not just a liberal thing. When we're talking about this, it's coming from a place of privilege, of not understanding the histories behind the negative stereotypes associated with blackface. So we're going to watch another video, and I think videos for you all explain better and provide a larger picture of that. So this is from Sunday morning, CBS Sunday Morning, and it's a brief, we're not going to watch all of it. But
as you may have heard, NBC Today host Megyn Kelly's show was canceled this past week following her on-air remarks expressing acceptance of blackface. It's a racist show business practice most of us thought was long gone. But as Maurice Dubois is about to tell us, blackface has a long history in our country. And we caution you. As remarks expressing acceptance of blackface, it's a racist show business practice most of us thought was long gone. But as Maurice Dubois is about to tell us, blackface has a long history in our country. And we caution you, his report unavoidably includes many offensive and disturbing images.
It happens all too frequently, often at Halloween, but not exclusively.
They thought it was a joke, but it really just was not funny at all.
For example, 2 years ago in Maplewood, New Jersey.
Her daughter posted this photo of herself and a friend in blackface.
The two girls had no idea what blackface was or the history of it.
The history of blackface is long and complex and deeply ingrained in our culture.
Who was that lady I saw you with this afternoon? That was no lady. That was my wife.
Even Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd blacked up.
Fantastic, isn't it?
For more than 100 years, white and then Black performers wore dark makeup and created not only a popular theatrical form, but stereotypes that are still with us today.
This makes you uncomfortable, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It does make me feel uncomfortable to talk about these things because they are incredibly disturbing and revolting.
Eric Lott, a professor at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, says blackface represents a strange mix of envy, fascination, desire, and fear.
Explain the fear part to me. What are these white performers, what are these white people afraid of?
They're afraid of Black groups, mobs, rising up and taking the power.
Minstrel shows began in the 1830s, and white performers used burnt cork or later black grease paint. Minstrelsy eventually became the most popular form of entertainment in the country.
Ah, yes.
I asked Margot Jefferson, the Pulitzer Prize-winning critic, to look at some images from the New York Public Library.
The shininess of the black against the big white clown's mouth, the hat, the overlong tailcoat, mocking. It always gives me the jolt that racist history does. Blackface is so tied to comedy, to people enjoying themselves, to people having fun, that rattles you still more.
Well, Mr. Tambo, you seem to be enjoying yourself this evening. Enjoying myself? I sure is.
White minstrel performers claimed that what they did on stage was based on their perceptions of how black people lived.
Some of this came out of a genuine fascination with the music, the songs, the dances, the performance styles of black people.
But it's also where Jump Jim Crow was born, along with other characters depicted as lazy, lying, or buffoonish. Remember, this was all happening before the Civil War.
Slavery was all about creating visions, types, stereotypes of an entire race of people as subhuman in every way.
By the 1860s, African Americans began using blackface on stage.
Why on earth would a black performer put on blackface and demean him or herself?
Look, this is the 19th century. They had limited options. They were expected to.
Why?
Because it made the audiences comfortable. You can be fascinated, you can be excited, but you can always feel superior.
In effect, the black makeup on a black performer became a theatrical mask with many layers of meaning. Professor Eric Lotz.
The mask, I think, says to white audiences, you have nothing to fear. Go ahead, enjoy yourself. To black audiences, I think any number of things might have been communicated, like, can you believe that these people are making me put on this mask so they will be entertained? You know, in other words, there's a kind of winking to the black audience, but it gave black performers access to the stage.
One of the biggest black stars to come out of the minstrel tradition was Burt Williams, who wore blackface from vaudeville to Broadway.
It's clear that he was a genius of a performer.
But how did he reconcile performing in this demeaning art form?
He was very melancholy about it. He knew it was necessary for his career, as all other black performers knew it.
Minstrelsy on stage basically died out in the 1920s, but blackface lived on in the movies.
I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles.
In 1927, Al Jolson starred in the pioneering talking picture The Jazz Singer, playing a young man who prefers singing popular music rather than his family's traditional Hebrew prayers.
When? But I know where the sunshine sets.
I don't want to look at it. What reaction do you get?
I totally understand.
Wait a minute. I don't like the way he said that.
In the Our Gang comedies of the 1930s, Spanky appeared in blackface.
Buckwheat, did you say Spanky was in a lot of trouble? Yes, sir.
The gag here is that the gang doesn't realize that that's Spanky in blackface until they actually see Buckwheat.
Hiya, Buckwheat. Hiya, Buckwheat.
So the gist of it is that you put blackface makeup on anyone and they become black.
And that's supposed to be hilarious.
And it's supposed to be really funny.
When he grows up.
And it goes on. During the golden age of the Hollywood musical, Judy Garland.
When he walks down the street, folks will say, pleased to meet Mr. Franklin D. Roosevelt Jones.
Bing Crosby.
That's why we celebrate this blessed February day. Abraham.
Fred Astaire, and many others, all blacked up. It's still in the culture.
It is too easy, I think, simply to dismiss the history of blackface as that racist stuff. And most of us are better than that. I don't think most of us are better than that. We are that. That's what we are.
You know, some people say in order to move forward, we need to put this stuff behind us, as painful, as just upsetting that it may be.
Well, you know, any form of history that gets suppressed or repressed or erased out, it comes back to haunt. What has to happen now is a discussion, an acknowledgement of this charged, complicated, painful history.
So I'm going to have a discussion now as we've seen really the history of blackface, as we see here, college students stating that Black Lives Matter in their snap that they sent out to their friends, right? So one, I want to know, because I think part of this is all about taking action, right? Leadership is all about taking action. I'd like to know is, obviously we know that it's, hopefully by now you know that it's obvious that we shouldn't be wearing blackface, right? And we should, because of its racist history and undertones that it contains within it. So what would we do, or what would be an appropriate response if we saw someone make reference to or laugh about blackface? So we're gonna go ahead and ask for volunteers, or I'm gonna call on you. Francine, I see you can speak.
Yes, sorry. I think the appropriate response is pretty much to educate and just kind of give them the history of it. However, it is a bit difficult, just because there is a lot of, I don't know what the word is. I don't know if it's like opinions about it and whatnot, and it could just escalate into a bigger altercation. So I think that's what a lot of people fear when it comes to trying to educate someone who sees it one way, is just that it can cause just like a real big altercation and like a real big issue with all that.
Yeah, it could cause conflict, right? I think, right?
I just, but yeah, I'm really liking how we have this, because maybe you guys could show us what would be the appropriate way to deal with a conflict like that.
Absolutely, and that's exactly, Francine, what I was hoping that you would get to. Is right, when we bring up inherent conversations that touch on racism or any form of ism that takes place, whether it's homophobia or sexism or things of that nature, we really end up in a place that can cause people to become defensive, right? And there's some significant techniques that you can use to kind of diffuse the situation. Bringing it back to values, right? And say, I'd really like to know why you think this would be an appropriate response, right? So it's related to costumes. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. So what do you mean by costumes, right? Do you think that it's okay to make fun of people? And doing it in a way is like, what I'm hearing from you is that it's okay to make fun of people. And then maybe reframe the conversation and be like, would we like it? Do we like it when people make fun of our background or ethnicity or things of that nature, right? I think sometimes that and I think, Jennifer, you hit it on the head there, explaining that it is very significant to the lived histories and day-to-day interactions of our Black brothers and sisters here in the United States. And it's not just that it takes place here in the United States. As one of the earlier social justice leadership series had a conversation about colorism in the Latinx community, right? There's been shows, whether in Puerto Rico or Mexico, or even in Brazil, which is predominantly Black, where television personalities would make fun of those that are Black or wear blackface on these television shows. And so explaining to them that it's not a joke, right? It's making them feel less than you are, right? It's wonderful when we, as lighter skinned, can have the privilege of not having someone make fun of us all the time. But really trying to disarm them and just, I'd really like to understand what you mean by that, right? I'd really like to and lean in, right? Not like offensively, like, oh, what do you mean like that? But like, take it active listening and actually listen to what they're saying. Sometimes we too become defensive, right? And so we're already thinking of the next response, but truly come from where they're trying to do. Having difficult conversations is a life skill that many of our student leaders need to develop as they move into the workplace, right? Having difficult conversations, whether it's related to hiring or firing someone, or difficult conversations related to job performance, right? I'm not trying to equate these difficult conversations related to race to that, but I think that's a skill set that we need to develop. And I think ultimately it all comes and stems from this concept of vulnerability, right? We have to come to a place to say that we're vulnerable. We're really wanting to learn why they think things like this would be acceptable. Another question is, why do we still think that it's prevalent today, right? Like, we kind of know across the board, why is it that we think that it's prevalent, right? Like, why do we still see politicians or teachers, to that matter, say that it's okay, right? Like, there's no ill intent. They didn't mean anything, right? It's just a joke. Why do we think we see that? I want us to consider that, especially as we move into the next topic that we're going to be moving to. And I think we're educating ourselves as it relates to that. So we're going to talk here a little bit about cultural appropriation. These are all celebrities who have culturally appropriated other significant folks. So what does cultural appropriation mean? We're going to watch a short video once again. This is a 1-minute video.
A lot of people have been talking about cultural appropriation, but what exactly is it? A quick search tells you. The adoption or use of elements of one culture by members of a different culture. But there is a blurred line between appreciation and appropriation. Like when you're jamming out in a Native American headdress just because it looks cool, that's appropriation. It happens in music, in fashion, and in movies and TV. Oh, and just a reminder, blackface is never okay. And neither is redface for that matter. Appropriation occurs when a privileged culture borrows from a marginalized one. An appropriator can be a celebrity rocking cornrows when their hair clearly doesn't need them. Or even someone sporting a tribal tattoo when they have no idea what the design actually means. Culture is more than just a cool style or a new trend. And it doesn't matter if it's just a Halloween costume. Because in case you didn't realize, these are racist. But you can still appreciate another culture by learning about other traditions, trying an authentic cuisine, traveling to new countries, and following their customs, or even being invited to a cultural event or ceremony. Moral of the story, don't appropriate, appreciate.
So as we look forward here, cultural appropriation is the unacknowledged or inappropriate adoption or usage of the customs, practices, ideas, objects, or elements of one non-dominant society or group or people by a more dominant people or society that does not respect original meaning or significance. Basically, that's a long answer, right? To understand what cultural appropriation is. Basically, you're taking something that you as privilege, that's not part of your culture or background, you're taking it and exploiting it, right? You're exploiting it by not offering it reverence to or respecting it as that other culture does. So what does that look like, right? It trivializes historical oppression. So when we see folks at Coachella with their Indian headdresses, it removes the reason and the respect that tribal elders had to receive in order to do that. It was a lifelong journey for tribal chiefs to actually receive those headdresses. So when we just buy it off of Amazon and put it on because it looks trendy at Coachella, well, ultimately we're saying your lived experience, your lived history of oppression, your people's lived history of oppression, especially for Indigenous peoples, doesn't matter. I like it, it looks cool, and so I'm gonna wear it. And it takes away the respect that one had to have in the community to earn those. It also allows for folks, cultural appropriation allows for folks to show love for a culture that they ultimately stereotype or remain prejudiced towards, right? So, especially as we're talking about Indigenous, we still see stereotypes and prejudice happening against them of saying, we only want to interact with you in certain elements, right? We're not really wanting to learn about your traditions and your rituals and things. We just want to take what we like, whether it's the buckskin or the tribal headdress, but we're not actually going to learn anything about you. And we're actually going to keep you relegated to reservations in terms of Indigenous people and provide you with limited resources where we're maintaining a system of oppression where those limited resources therefore then lead to very negative outcomes in their education, in their health, in their wealth, things of that nature. It also means that you're profiting off of someone else's labor, right? So you're these folks, especially as it relates to Indigenous people, they have had these type of ceremonial rituals and garb for generations, and yet we've come in, mass manufactured it, and taken away the significance and meaning of it. It also stereotypes, spread stereotypes about those marginalized and minoritized peoples and cultures, right? So here we have Pharrell Williams in an Indigenous chief headdress, and yet he is not Indigenous, right? He is not paying homage to them. He's doing it because it looks cool. Because ultimately what it does is perpetuates nativism, which is I'm from here, you are not, and racism, I am better, you are not, right? It says that I as a white person or as a lighter skinned person should be able to utilize that items that we want to do. And we're not gonna take into account anything that's there. So we actually see this in Laredo. I love to bring things back to Laredo. Anyone tell me what this is a picture of? You can write it in the comments. Yes, WBCA, that's right, man. We culturally appropriate here in the city of Laredo. We have the Princess Pocahontas pageant. Ah, that wonderful, infamous WBCA, right? Did Pocahontas ever come to Laredo? Did George Washington ever come to Laredo? If you actually were to do a deep dive on the history of the WBCA, it was actually created by Anglos, white folks, to oppress Mexicans here in Laredo. And it was created, limited Latino, Hispanic folks that had lighter skin were allowed to join in on those festivities, right? And so the Princess Pocahontas has been here for a very, very long time, almost over 100 years in the city of the Princess Pocahontas. It's been over 100 years, that it's been here. And yet we don't celebrate the Huiltican folk that are actually Indigenous people of Laredo, right? There are Indigenous people that do not have space, that are not recognized by the federal government as an Indigenous Native people to the United States, right? When we think about the creation of Laredo, when we think about the creation of the state of Texas, because they were Mexicans, they had a lot of their land stolen after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the 1840s. Mexican owners who had land were removed that property, but certain light-skinned Latinos here in Laredo were allowed to keep that. So this was a celebration of wealth. When this was initially created back in the early 1900s, and even up until the 1970s, to be part of the Princess Pocahontas pageant only really cost someone $75 to rent a horse and about $75 on the costume, etc. Today, we're seeing tens of thousands of dollars being spent on the horse. We're bringing in non-Indigenous horses. So we're bringing in Appaloosas, which are very foreign to Laredo and Texas. We're spending upwards of $5,000 on headgear and dresses that really have no significance to the city of Laredo. And in fact, while we're celebrating Pocahontas, we're actually doing a disservice to the Indigenous peoples whose land this is. on Monday, we will have a conversation about celebrating place here in Laredo and through an Indigenous lens, and understanding how Laredo and Indigenous folks, so the Coahuiltecan people, celebrate place. We're going to bring in someone from the Dene tribe that is part Cherokee from the University of Wisconsin La Crosse to discuss this, right? So we look at cultural appropriation taking place here in the city of Laredo and is celebrated. There have been numerous exposés, books, articles, dissertation theses written about this really disconnect, right? When we look at Princess Pocahontas, it was predominantly excluded. Latinos were predominantly excluded up until the 1970s from even participating. It was a white person's pageant. As we moved forward, we're still not having levels of equity, right? But because while Latinas and Latinos are able to participate, right, as the escorts, the Latinos and Latinas are able to participate in it. What we're doing, though, is making this a form of classism, right? So we're saying, and predominantly many of these folks that are participating are of lighter skin. So we know that history, as we learned through colorism conversation a few weeks ago, that in the Latino community, there is a lot of colorism, which then leads to the capacity to have resources, right? So those that are darker skinned Latinos tend to come from lower income backgrounds. And so only those that have the access to those resources are able to fully participate in society. So as we move forward here, we have a discussion that I, once again, the questions didn't come over, but what would you do and how can you, so we're just gonna go back here. How can you have a conversation with someone that is culturally appropriating Indigenous people's culture or their objects that are very significant and spiritual? How do you think you can have a conversation with folks related to that? Anyone? So you can have a civil and educated, but how do you begin that? So right, so I know that Laredoans love the WBCA, right? Right, and so Jennifer, that's an interesting concept, right, Jennifer Ramos, that you had to explain to a girl who wanted to join the Pocahontas that natives are highly oppressed, not only in this country, but here in Laredo as well, and in the southern Texas area, they don't have any land. They're living off of cultural exchanges that are taking place in elementary schools, high schools, and universities, and they're not actually able to promote their communities. They were marched on the Trail of Tears, not necessarily those that are indigenous to Laredo, but their other tribe, those other tribes that are here, it's very damaging, right? And so one of the things that I really truly hope that we're able to take away from today is asking folks, like, what would it be like? As I think you can see here over on the left, if you just saw some folks across the United States all wearing that, as you see here, let me see if I can get my little highlighter or pen right here. As you can see here, oh, that's actually not letting me do it. There we go, laser pointer right here, right? You can see it right here. People are wearing a sombrero and celebrating the identity, quote unquote, identity of being Latinx is the wearing a sombrero with a mustache and a burro in front, and maybe sometimes there's Cinco de Drinko events that take place, right? So they're taking cultures that are part of who we are, right? Cinco de Mayo actually isn't Mexican independence, as we know here in Laredo, but others actually throughout the United States celebrate Cinco de Mayo as the independence of Mexico from Spain, right? So how would we have conversations with them, right? Politely educating about the history, right? That's good. But ultimately, I think it's exposing them to the feelings that they may have, right? So flipping it maybe necessarily about their script and saying, that's just wrong. I think part of it is like, how would you feel if you were in another area that those that were in power, white folk, predominantly white folk, would be wearing and stereotyping Mexican communities. Now, I get that right now on a national level, we are having very difficult conversations related to race, related to stereotyping of different ethnicities, such as Latinx, Hispanic, Latinos, right? When we hear our elected officials talk about our people in a way that makes us feel bad, right? I think that's off-putting to a lot of folks. And so we just put up a lot of walls and barriers. But I think, we don't have to explain the history or things, just maybe sometimes just flipping it on its script and say, well, how do you feel when someone says, Mexicans are always drunk, playing to the stereotype of the drunk Mexican, or Latinos are always hot in bed, right? Or things of that nature. How do you then break down those stereotypes that are there? And that's where sometimes it's like, oh, I didn't maybe think about that. I will caution when having these conversations, and I put these into the difficult conversations, sometimes folks are just so entrenched in their own beliefs and their own thought processes that they are unable to actually understand the harm and the hurt that it does exhibit, right? Just as there's some folks that look at children in cages and are not affected by it, right? Where children were removed from their parents' arms while they were breastfeeding, or the same way they were removed from having, were forced sterilization back in the early 20th century until the mid 20th century, or even today in the 21st century with women that are in detention camps in Georgia who have forced hysterectomies, where they were removed their reproductive capacity as they immigrated to the United States. Just think about it from that perspective, that they're fine with that. And I think at some point we can say that we're just going to agree to disagree, right? We're just not going to change them. But I think a majority of folk across the board, when we have conversations of saying a culture is not a costume, as it says here, we're able to actually yield better results coming from a educative place, as you all are doing today. We are at our time. I do want to leave time for questions, conversations, or things of that nature. They are doing involuntary sterilization in Leslie, you are correct, Leslie Gonzalez, you are correct, they are doing that in ICE detention facilities in Georgia. That's what I was referring to. They are removing women's uteruses, and that is what a hysterectomy is. And so if you have questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to. But once again, I do greatly appreciate you all coming in and learning about this. This is something that, especially if you were to be going to a predominantly white institution, let's say, I don't know, College Station or UT or Corpus Christi, you would probably encounter yourselves as Latinas, Latinos, Hispanics, probably encounter quite a bit of racist stereotypes related to your background, right? For example, when people were asked you, where are you from? And you say you're from Laredo. No, where are you really from? Trying to figure out, are you Mexican? Are you American? Are you Guatemalan? Things of that nature, and never really believing where you're from. Or you speak really good English, right? When English was your first language, right? Like that, those are called microaggressions. But I appreciate everyone coming in today. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Try to stay warm. Have a great Halloween where you're not wearing someone else's culture as a costume and things of that nature.
Thank you, everybody. Make sure you track your attendance. Click on the link so you can get your t-shirt and your voucher. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and put the assessment as well, the survey. And I'll also email this to you. But let me go ahead and share that with you so you can fill out the survey as well. So let me share that. It's loading. Okay, here it is.
Actually, Nayeli, we're going to go ahead and send it out to them via email.
Okay. Okay, we'll do it. So just make sure you, yeah, that's the link, Brianna. Do you want me to put the attendance link again? I can do that. I just put the attendance link. It's the same one. Here, it's like this long one.
I have a question for picking up the voucher and the shirt.
Yes, that's me.
Okay, so I recently injured my knee and I can't really move around much. Is there any way I could get someone to pick it up for me?
Yes, I received your email. If you could just let me know in your email who the student is, that way we just know who's gonna come and pick it up for you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, thank you, everybody. Bye, everybody. Thank you.